Hey guys, welcome to another episode of This is Coffee Thunder. It's not Beer Thunder because I'm doing Sober October, and I've been a pretty good boy. And while I've been a pretty good boy, I've also been experimenting and flying out with the F-15A again, because the F-15A is a plane of all time, and it's one of Gaijin's favorite planes apparently, and it's one of mine, especially at 13.0, because 13.0 got decompressed. And what does that actually mean? What does it actually entail? Well, previously, before the decompression patch hit, the F-15A would have fought at pure top tier, but now it only fights at pure top tier only half of the time. So basically, on 50% of days, you're going to be fighting SAR-H missiles, and then on the other 50% of days, you're going to be fighting active radar missiles. And this plane currently sits at 13.0, and on 13.0 days, when it's down tiered, really the hardest opposition that you find is JAS-39A and other F-15s, and then there's a French F-16 with AIM-9Ms, but for the most part, you're fighting MiG-29s and Yak-141s, Soviet stuff, and none of the Soviet stuff has aged very well. And on the other hand, the F-15A, for me at least, has kind of aged like fine wine, because I put out a video about this probably about a year ago, and didn't really think too much about it. It's not that I didn't play the plane, it's not that I didn't revisit it. Like, I've dueled a lot in the plane, and the flight model on this thing is superb. It's basically probably one of the top 3 in the game. It is one of the top 3 at top tier as far as I am concerned. Really, the only 2 things that give you kind of like an honest-to-God challenge are going to be like GRIPEN, Mirage 2000, in some cases the F-15A. Yes, I know the F-15A flight model is better on paper, but the strength of the F-15 in the flight model performance is not just that the flight model's good and you have a way of winning consistently in one way against everything. It's like, no, you can do basically everything at the same time all at once. You have a very strong initial turn, you have very strong low speed handling, you have very strong flaps, and you have a very strong sustained turn rate, you have very strong thrust to weight ratio, and it means that when you go up into like a 1v1 matchup, when you actually merge with people, you can play it of basically one of 2 ways, and both of those ways are equally valid, and you can transition between like an aggressive playstyle and a passive playstyle. You can transition between kind of forcing like horizontal turns where you run the guy out of energy, or you can just go in a little bit slower, pull your flaps all the way out, and just kind of yank into the guy and shoot him. On top of that, the kit on this thing for 13.0 is still one of the best. The AIM-9M is still a meta-defining heat-seeking missile. If you shoot this thing from side aspect, the guy's not going to see it, he's not going to know that it's on its way, and it's going to hit. Even from front aspect, it's invisible. Rear aspect, also invisible. You get 4 of them, which is not the leading class where the JAS-39 gets 6 of them, but you also get 4 radar missiles to back up your AIM-9Ms, and the radar missiles are the second best. They're not the R-27ERs, but they're AIM-7s, and for this tier, they're perfectly fine. They're a perfectly adequate, middle-of-the-line, consistently reliable missile. And you've got the flight performance to use them, and you've got a radar that I think we kind of slept on this radar, to be honest. Because what I was doing previously is I was using the wide scan. I was using kind of like a bigger, wider scan that also like went up and down a lot, and that means that it takes a while to refresh. So the way I've been using this radar a lot recently is making a deliberate effort to utilize the head-on mode and the narrower search patterns, and kind of having like a deliberate scanning process that kind of gives me some situational awareness before I go into engagement. So normally what I'll do is when I'm coming out of my base, I'm going to alternate at 74 kilometers with the head-on mode and the regular mode, just to get kind of like a general picture of like what's going on in the distance with a wide scan, but then I'll switch to like a narrow scan and just kind of like pan the thing left to right on the horizon, because that'll give me kind of like the same information but quicker, because with the narrow scan, you're not spending as much time repeating scans up into like the stratosphere at like heights that you don't need, because generally at this tier people still hug the deck. Most of these maps are still pretty flat, and you couple the radar returns with the RWR, and you can kind of start to plan out some of the engagements, or at least go into a situation knowing what to expect. Like, yes, the radar doesn't have track wall scan, and I wish that it did. I do prefer having track wall scan, but I've kind of reached the point where I've kind of gotten over that, where if you asked me a year ago if I prefer the MiG-29 radar versus this one, I'd say no, the MiG-29 radar is nicer to have because it has TWS. but because of the radar changes, because of the double scan pattern problem, I would rather have this radar right now because it's more reliable, because the track wall scan on the MiG-29 is nice when it works, is not nice because you don't have that refresh rate, so you can't really keep deliberate track of things nearly as well. The other thing that this one has that the MiG-29 doesn't, has like bootleg TWS, where you can hard lock a target and then switch to rate assessment mode, where I think the guy's like RWR ping goes back to like a normal track, and it'll give you kind of like this very narrow scope of TWS that doesn't actually do IFF. That is somewhat useful. It can be utilized. I'm utilizing it. I don't think it's a game changer. I don't think it makes up for like a lack of TWS, but I also think that if you take the time to deliberately learn the radar and kind of like set up like deliberate zones where you're like, hey, at 74 kilometers, if there's nothing in front of me and like my nearest target is like a long ways away, I don't really need to be spending a lot of time looking outside the cockpit, because I do have the RWR and I do have the radar, so I can kind of spend more time panning the radar back and forth. At the same time, once something gets within like 20 kilometers, you might just kind of turn it off and kind of pretend that it doesn't exist and kind of like take a deliberate step back and go, okay, now I need to put my head back in the cockpit and need to focus on what is going around me. Now, as far as like planning out engagements with the radar, use the RWR to figure out what's in front so that you know that, hey, I'm merging with a MiG-29 followed by a GRIPEN. Maybe you ignore the 29 to merge with the GRIPEN so that you're not eating a 9M in the vertical and giving a sideways aspect. Anyways, that's a small rant, and we're going to just kind of move on to some matchups here, because this plane's incredibly good. The flight model is that strong. This is an older game. This is from when before I went on vacation, and we get a guy who's experienced. Murph comes in with MiG-29, and this is over in basically a turn. Any kind of fight that you go into, you can end it very quickly if you are proficient in your basic fighter weapons maneuvering, and it doesn't matter how experienced the player is as far as I'm concerned. There is not a single player in the game that I'm worried about in any plane when I'm flying the F-15. The plane is that good that basically no matter what, it's not no matter what, I'm always going to win, I'm literally the best. It's like, no, every fight that I take in this thing, though, I think is basically winnable. I think we've got Gerbo here in the Mirage 2000, and we go in and we kind of compete with the Mirage 2000 on its own terms. Our low speed is not nearly as good. It's not perfect. Our rate is a little bit better. Our vertical is a little bit better because we have more engine thrust, but we're just going to kind of ride behind him. And from this position, we're just winning. We're just going to win. And this guy is not someone who I would consider to be like, wow, this guy's terrible. Most of the people that you run into at EC are going to be worse than like the guys that I'm showing here. I think this next one, this is Nimble Target. You've seen his YouTube videos. He's in a Mirage 4000. We're going to run into him 3 or 4 different times in this game. He goes up, we go up, we get our position, and we're going to start just holding the trigger and then riding his ass. Mirage 4000, very good for thrust to weight, very good at low speed, but with that kind of like little wingtip crit there, he's going to spin out. If I fly in front of the guns, it would be an epic kill, but I mean, he's dead. Like, he's not going to do anything at this point. I can go up and come back down into him. Now, speaking of Nimble, I have done duels in the F-15A against him a long time ago, and the results are surprising. I won 12, and he won 3. That's how strong, that's how unpredictable the F-15A is, like, once you're, like, proficient with it. Yes, the F-16A, the Block 10, the Block 15, both of those flight models are better. They have a little bit higher potential as far as, like, dogfighting goes. But this plane is really, 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 really strong. It is probably hands down one of the most versatile airframes in the game, and I can't really stress the versatility enough. Nimble comes in again, we get the merge, we get the hit, he has to fly away, he gets hit by missile, easy clap again. And now we're going up against a GRIPEN. This is modestly simple. This is more recent footage. This is going to kind of show how I deal with GRIPENs in like 2 ways. Number one, you can go in and you can kind of loop around them, kind of energy them, and as long as you see like the contrails on their wingtips and don't fly in front of their guns, you can kind of rate them to death. It's not perfectly reliable. If someone like has hands in the GRIPEN, they can play it really well, and they do have the railgun where they will probably shoot you. But if you have less fuel, if things are going right, you can kind of just out-energy them. And the Gripen, once it gets slow, has a little bit of a problem getting fast again. Or at least that's my experience playing the thing against Butters. That's my experience playing against other people in F-15, where we kind of have a process where there are mistakes that the Gripen can make now that are counterable, that you can use, like planes like the F-15, F-16. Any of like the good top-tier flight models are not as good as the Gripen, but it's not nearly as bad as it used to be. Even Mirage 2000, because of the low-speed stuff, can compete pretty well. But we're just going to go around and we're just going to do like kind of a rate fight. As long as we don't cut down underneath of him where he can point his nose down into us, gain a bunch of speed, we're going to be fine. He's probably going about 550 kph right now, maybe all the way down to 400. He can't point his nose up here. As long as we keep him in this horizontal turn, we add a little bit of altitude as we go up. We're gaining altitude on him. And then eventually we're going to dump our flaps, we're going to cut down into him, and then we're going to hose him down. Now, is this the best way to tackle a Gripen? On paper, maybe. Might be the most reliable way, but it's also the one that takes the longest, the one that is going to open you up to being third-partied. So it's not necessarily like the line of thinking that I recommend. And we're going to showcase like something else in the next one, because modestly simple here, he was going 7-0, and then I joined this game in the F-15, and I was like, well, I'm going to fun police him. I got to make sure that I'm the only one allowed to have fun, and it's basically exactly what I did. Now, we get a second merge here, and this is the way that I like to play the F-15. Get a little bit slower, use the air brake just a little bit, and get your position first. I get my position behind him, and I can just go up with him. He can't really do anything at this point. He's overshot, he's made a mistake, and we're just going to basically win the duel in a turn and a half. And that's how strong the 15 flight model is. It's really, really, really fucking good. And the German and Russian tech trees don't really have a plane at 13.0 that they can field against this thing that is really honestly competitive. Like, yes, the MiG-29G exists on paper, but dealing with that plane in practice is a lot easier than people theory craft it to be, because people have this idea in their head that the R-27ER at this tier is like the super duper dominant BVR missile, when in reality everyone's still flying at 60 meters on the deck, everyone's still merging, AIM-9Ms are still very strong, and American teams are still incredibly imbalanced. You still just have more people on your team, more people to cause distractions, better equipment, better sensors, better flight models, and it's really easy to just kind of go in and just frag Russian mains and frag German mains until they quit the game and then the game's dead. And what has happened is this 13.0 BR, it's kind of dead. It's kind of really more or less carried by having France and Sweden on the enemy side for some of it, where you can have kind of like equally potent NATO flight models fighting each other. And like the MiG-29 it's basically a support fighter. It's basically just there. It's still viable. It's still viable against like a bunch of random people. Like I played it recently. It's not impossible to use, but if you gave me the option between what plane to fly, a MiG-29, even with R-73s or this thing, I would pick this thing any day of the week. I am very experienced in basically countering MiG-29s. And I would even be willing to go a step further and say that the utility value of having 4 AIM-7Fs outweighs the advantages that the ER has, because you only have 2 of them, and a lot of the situations where you would get a kill with an R-27ER is the exact same situation where you could get a kill with the AIM-7F. Namely, like when people go up in a dogfight, they break the multipath height, they can't really set up to avoid the missile. When you're using it as a third-party missile, the 27ER is better because it gets there quicker, but most of the time you can just get a little bit closer with the 7F and you're going to get the kill. So on average, even if we say that the R-27ER is 2 guaranteed kills per game or per flyout, we would also say that probably 4 AIM-7Fs is probably worth 3 kills or 2.5 kills. You'll just get more utility value out of it, and you get the advantages of flying a plane that's not dookie dog shit. In all honesty, the most challenging aspect of this tier is not going to be the Russian planes, it's not going to be the German planes, it's not going to be the majority of the enemy team. It's going to be the NATO planes that are on the enemy team. And this plane can take on other NATO planes, and if you know what you're doing, you're going to have a really damn good chance against them. And that's not something that I can say about the MiG-29. The MiG-29 has weak matchups against every single NATO plane. The Mirage 2000, if it's flown well, is basically kryptonite to the MiG-29. The F-15A is also, even against like the 29G, is basically kryptonite as soon as the merge happens. As long as the guy like has like half of a brain, knows how to pull in like the same direction, doesn't bleed all of his speed right away, it doesn't really matter how good you are on the MiG-29. You are basically forced defensive, forced to run away from the F-16. He's probably still going to kill you. I've seen it happen. I've seen Messerjokel just go into a nimble target MiG-29G game and just bully the fuck out of him with the F-16A. Like, the dude was doing really good up until fucking Catboy Rabies shows up, turns his radar off, and as soon as that merge happens, it's just kind of like, well, GG fighters, let's go next. And that's not really to brag about it. That's just kind of pointing out that with the MiG-29, with the flight model, with kind of the cumulative capabilities of the plane, there's just hard limits to what you can expect to do with the damn thing. And that means that expecting just the MiG-29 flight model and the R-27ER to carry red side teams at this tier just really hasn't panned out. It's not happening. It's not going to happen. And it means that this tier is kind of one of those, like another one of those dead tiers where it's a free win if you play USA and it's the struggle bus if you play anything else. It means kind of like during the week, because it's not popular, you're probably going to have to play America against America in like a full mixed lobby, or you're just going to go into a lobby that's 6v3, and you'll probably get team killed more often than you get killed by the enemy team, to be honest. Like, the players on your team are a bigger threat to you than the enemy team is. So it means that while this plane is enjoyable, while I really like this plane, I don't really enjoy the matchmaker that it's in. It's fun once in a while, but because you're playing in what amounts to like a Mickey Mouse game mode, and you feel like your hand is being held every step of the way, I don't feel like I'm growing in this. I don't feel really kind of any emotional attachment to it. And I think that's one of the biggest shortcomings with the battle ratings decompression that we have experienced. Basically, more things have more days to shine, but more or less any day of the week that you play, the American thing is always going to be almost the shiniest. Like, the only thing that I think at this tier that is even easier to play is probably the GRIPEN and probably the F-15A, the French one that has AIM-9Ms. Outside of that, at this tier, MiG-29 is just not it. And to me, because of the way that the game currently works, it is very hard for me to recommend that people grind out other tech trees other than the USA. The USA has the best air tech tree for sim. Basically, no matter what day of the week that you play, you have so many options for battle ratings brackets that are basically free. Like, they just moved the F8U from 10.3, the most viable 10.3 in the game by my estimation. They moved it down to 10.0. 9.0 to 10.0 days are free wins for the F8U. 10.3 down to 9.3, free wins. The F4E, the Phantom, has been moved from 11.0 down to 10.7. 10.7 has a day where it's the top battle rating bracket, and it's basically farming free wins for the F4E. The only two kind of like competitive Soviet brackets are MiG-21 BIS at 11.0, and then the bullshit MiG-23 getting moved down to 11.3. Kind of like that 11 to 12.0 is kind of the only battle rating range where the USA tech tree is like either not like clearly the best or clearly the second best option for the day. So what is the solution to make this 13.0 matchmaker a little bit more viable, a little bit more fun, a little bit more flexible and interesting? I think the solution is actually pretty simple. It just involves taking some of our 13.3 planes and moving them down to 13.0, or alternatively you could make a 13.3 matchmaking bracket and move like some stuff that's at 13.0 up to 13.3. You could approach it from that way too. The end result would be kind of the same, but basically take the F4F Ice, move it to 13, take the Tornado, the F3 Late, move it to 13, so that those two planes at top tier, they're not really competitive because they're just kind of AMRAAM missile buses. Everything at top tier has AMRAAMs or equivalent, can outrange them and basically outdo them. Moving them down here is not really going to change the makeup of the match that much because you already have Fakor 90s going all the way across the map. You already have AMRAAMs in the form of Harriers, so moving those planes in isn't really going to introduce any kind of like new technology capability, and those airframes aren't like really maneuverable enough that anything should really be struggling against them. The other thing I would do, move the 27 down, move the old 27s down, the regular 27 that has the bad RWR, the Chinese one that has the bad RWR, that don't have active radar missiles, move them down. Yeah, they might be the best 13.0 at that point. We've already experienced what it's like for AIM-9M mobiles to fight the R-27ER missile bus, and guess what? Back in the day, the R-27ER missile bus didn't really stand a chance against the radar-off AIM-9M Slinger. That's what I would do. I would start there and then worry about that. Now, there are some planes at 12.0 that don't need to be fighting 13.0s. They can move down. All of like the Pulse Doppler Phantoms can probably move down a BR step. I think that would be fine. I don't think that those planes are like super duper oppressive with their AIM-7Fs fighting like MiG-23 MLs, MLDs. They can move down a step if you don't want them to have to fight against like F-15s like on their worst day of the week. Currently, they already do. So even if they stayed the same, I don't think moving the 27 down is going to make them suffer any more than they already do. Anyways, that's the end of my rant. That's the end of my TED Talk. Let me know in the comments what you think. Let me know how I'm wrong. Let me know how I'm not appreciating the R-27ER as the world-ending missile that it is. I'll respond to the comments. We'll engage the YouTube algorithm. And at some point, we'll get a monopod bird sticker as like an official Gaijin decal if everyone likes and subscribes.